Good morning, everyone. I think this is the only fader talk of this day. I'm talking about the fader character as mask, which is a fader about the distance between the fictional character and the player. So how similar is the character to the player? At one end of the spectrum, we have differentiation, which means that the character and the player are completely different. There is nothing similar between the player and the character. And at the other end, we have thin characters, which means that the character is basically the player, perhaps even with the player's name, it's just in this fictional setting. And you can sort of go through the whole spectrum there. So the key question with this slider is, how much does the player influence the character on purpose as a result of design choices? So this is about about design, this fader. So if you let the players create the characters, then of course you have no control of this fader. But if you, as a LARP organizer, create the characters, then you have control over this fader. And it is also about how much bleed happens on purpose in this LARP. Can you turn it so that I can see my notes? Oh, yeah, sure. All right. Thank you. Oh. Ah. Sorry about that. Yep. All right. I'm going to say a few words about history. Role-playing games, as in Dungeons and Dragons, one of the things that inspired them was transportation literature. These are stories and books where a normal person, an everyday person from our world steps into a fantasy world. For example, Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is about this, but also John Carter on Mars or Alice in Wonderland. This is the idea that an everyday person stumbles into a fictional world. So this was an idea that influenced role-playing games in the beginning, this idea that you are instead of there being a fictional character, you're playing yourself in a fictional world. So there was this idea of playing yourself, maybe an idealized version of yourself in the role-playing game or later in a LARP. So there's this idea of transportation included in if you have a thin character. Then another key interesting element relating to this fader is bleed. As Jaakko explained on the first day, bleed is about the emotions of the player influencing those of the character, or the emotions or experiences of the character bleeding out of the LARP and influencing the player. Of course, all role-playing involves some bleed. I mean, this is why we do role-playing. We want to be affected somehow. So having those experiences and feelings travel in and out of the LARP or the role-playing is expected. But we talk about bleed when this happens when this effect is particularly strong. And bleed is most commonly brought on by intensity or thin characters. With intensity, I mean that when you get so much into the LARP, into the playing, that you sort of forget for a while your everyday persona, and then often there is bleed. So sort of the distance between the character and the player becomes short. And also when you have purposefully designed thin characters, then there's a higher probability of bleed. But when we are thinking about the player and the character as a mask, we can think about the player, the character, and the role. The person who participates in a LARP is a player. A character is a fictional persona with a background, relationships, personality, goals, and a situation. And then a role, as Eirik explained yesterday, comes from in a sociological sense, is the situational agency, the things that you can do as someone in a social situation. Or, for example, you can be a sister, a lover, a doctor, a vampire, an addict. These are roles that you can play in a specific situation. Now, in a LARP, the player usually provides the body of the character. So that is where the character is usually fairly thin. It is similar to the body of the player. Then the character provides the psychology, and in this case that usually means the personality and the experience. The character, as we usually receive it in a LARP, is what has happened to that fictional persona before and what kind of personality do they have. For example, they can be shy, desperate, talkative, hungry, privileged, they can be a college graduate and so forth. And then the roles that you have, they emerge in play, and some are more familiar than others. So for example, there are different ways that there can be similarities between these, between the player and the character. So how similar is the body of the player to the body of the character? This is one question you can ask. For example, do the player and the character share the same ethnicity, skin tone, height, weight, shape, ability, voice, gender, sexuality, age? How similar are those things? Because we can play with all of these things. How similar is the personality and the life experience of the player and the character? So personal history, name, education, class, love, life, trauma, so forth and so forth. And then how similar are the roles that you play that you inhabit as a person to the roles that you inhabit as a character? Sort of occupational, social roles, family dynamics. For example, sort of the similarity of the body is in LARPs that there's usually a fairly close correspondence between the body of the player and the body of the character. But it can also be changed. The similarity of the personality and the experience often changes, especially when there are pre-created characters. And then the roles are something that can also be played with. For example, I teach at the university in my real life, and when I play College of Wizardry as a professor, even though my character in every other way is very different from me, the things that I do at that LARP are still sometimes something that are very similar to what I do outside of the LARP. And for example, if we look at the LARPs we played here, the New Voices in Art, I know that we have a number of artists in the room, and I'm fairly certain that New Voices in Art was very different for them because there were roles and situations that were similar, close to home for them. Close to home is the term that we use when a character is very similar to the player. We most specifically use this when referring to history and experience, but the roles also are included here. And we use close to home to bring focus on either the topic or we want to put emphasis on the player's emotional baggage. This means that, for example, we could have a LARP about bullying, and everybody's sort of, all the players will be reflecting on their bullying experiences or experiences of bullying, so that topic would put emphasis on. Or then we could have a LARP where sort of everybody is exploring something that is interesting and important for them, and they are reflecting on that, not as a group, but individually. And of course, when you're creating these characters, it can be difficult to know, sort of if you want to design a LARP where things are played close to home, you don't know all your players, so how do you ensure that the characters are similar? And this is something that of course can be workshopped. So you can, in the workshop, you can ask questions like, sort of think about your most recent relationship or your worst moment in life, or someone who you love who is not here, and sort of you can, in the workshop, you can bring in the emotional baggage of the player. So if we look at the fader, at the one end we have differentiation, which means that the player and the character are completely different. The wonderful things about this is that the player gets to see the world through different eyes. You get to inhabit another character, another viewpoint. It supports escapism. It's basically a vacation from your everyday life, which means that when you go into a LARP, you forget, you replace your worries with the worries of the character. It puts emphasis on empathy. And then you can design any kinds of characters. You don't have to think about who your players are because it doesn't matter. There needs to be no correspondence. It's easier to cast those players, and it gives stronger alibi to the players. You know, the things that I did in the LARP shouldn't reflect back on me because the character was not at all like me. Of course, it's more work to create such characters, and for players it's much more difficult to portray a character that is completely different from you. And in any case, the players will bring in themselves. The player will shine through in some places anyway, so total differentiation is an illusion. So this is just an ideal. At the other end, we have thin characters. And one thing to note about thin characters is that there's a difference between a thin character and a minimalist character. A thin character is a character that is very similar to you, and a minimalist character is a very short character. So a thin character would be somebody who's very much like Jaakko, and a minimalist character could be like the whole character is Elf King. And that's the whole thing. That's not a thin character, that's a minimalist character. Anyway, so the good things about thin characters is that there's a strong connection between the player and the character, so it's easy to sort of get into the playing. The character is more complete, complex, and believable because the player has such a strong connection to those experiences. And in a way, you can think of the whole life of the player leading up to the moment the LARP starts as workshopping, then sort of it's prepared the player for this specific LARP. But on the other hand, you have weaker alibi, because the character is very similar to the player. It can lead to typecasting. If there's the same person who always played the loudmouthed asshole, or then you have the person who is always taking care of others or whatever. Sort of it easily leads to typecasting. And then, as an organizer, you also need to think if you're willing and able to deal with the possible bleed that will result. Of course, in LARPs, usually we are somewhere in the middle. The players, using the player's biography in some way is a shortcut to full characters. Relating to a character is easier if there is some similarity. Players will, as mentioned, bring their baggage in anyway, because you can't leave your experiences behind. And of course, when there are gaps, and there are always gaps in the fiction in a LARP, the players will find it easier to fill it with stuff that is familiar to them. So a few design questions to think about when thinking about the difference between the character and the player. What am I trying to achieve with this LARP? Am I doing this for kicks, for gossip, for self-therapy, or for some other reason? Because there are also bad reasons for doing thin characters. Do you want fathers playing fathers and doctors playing doctors, or do you want to mix it up? Do you want the roles in and out to reflect each other, or do you want to have escapism? How to incorporate players' character wishes. Because often players sign up to a LARP and they have some sort of wishes as to what kind of a character they would want to play. So how do you take that into account? And then, of course, do you want to give away this fader? If the players create the characters themselves, then you have no idea whether they are very differentiated or whether they're very, very thin. All right. Thank you.